All right, my friends, welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back to the Athletic Health Podcast. We are absolutely rocking and rolling through. I'm not even sure what episode this is. I don't know why, Dan. I don't know why there's this. For the podcast hosts, there's like this pull, this like gravitational pull to like exclaim how many episodes you have. It's like a notch on your belt, like right in the beginning of every episode. I don't know what that is, but I find myself saying it every single time. But ladies and gentlemen, we have an awesome guest here today. Somebody that I've known for a while, somebody who is deep in the weeds of cardiovascular stuff, which is like top of mind of the Athletic Health Podcast listeners, because we've been doing a lot with that lately. But Dan Cerone, longtime friend of mine, he's the lead exercise specialist at a longevity-focused practice, and he is going to be, truthfully, I'm being selfish here, Dan. You're teaching me today, man. You're teaching me. I got the notepad out. I got the notes. And we're really just bringing everybody along for the ride. So, Dan, thank you so much for joining us.
Of course, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, man. All right. So let's set the stage for the team out here, okay? So a couple months back, I'm hyped that I did this CPAT testing. You put the mask on, it gets mad likes on Instagram. So like I'm flowing, I'm digging it. And then I'm like in my DMs, I'm getting messages from a bunch of people and, telling me, the results aren't what they seem. And then I'm getting all this other information. And Dan was one of the guys who shot me a message and started talking about lactate testing. Now, I have heard of lactate testing, but truth be told, I don't know what it is. So let's just start from scratch, Dan. What is lactate testing? What is the deal with this?
Yeah, so lactate testing really is just the means to measure your exertion level and partially to describe how your energy is being utilized during exercise. A lot of times when someone goes and gets a CPAT test done, it spits back out a report, and that report will give them these estimated heart rate zones that they should train at, from typically it's zone 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5.
Yes.
The issue with heart rate zones is they don't really tell us what's happening physiologically inside of our system, whereas lactate testing can, with more accuracy, tell us what's actually happening from a fuel utilization standpoint. And as a byproduct of that, we can estimate how fatiguing a certain activity is for an individual.
Okay. So with the CPAT, those zones, is that still an estimate?
It's pretty much an estimate because they're basing that off of your max heart rate and then just percentages from your max heart rate. Okay. But max heart rate does not always correlate with what's happening physiologically. Okay. In the sense that you can have someone's estimated zone 2 be about 130 to 135, for example, but they might be working too hard. They might be working too easy if they're targeting that heart rate zone for every one of their zone 2 runs or zone 2 rides on a bike.
Okay. So here's my next logical question. So I'm getting this. This is the real deal in terms of like where your body is at from an exertion intensity standpoint. So we're measuring lactate levels in the blood. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. So then can you walk me through the process? Like why lactate? Why am I measuring that as the exertion thing?
So I'm sure at some point in time, everyone's heard of lactate, whether it's with strength training, cardiovascular training, and how lactate is this bad thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Lactate is not a bad thing. Lactate is actually a good thing because it allows our body to utilize more energy when it needs to. The issue when lactate levels get too high is these hydrogen ions start to build up inside our cells, and those hydrogen ions accumulating and not being able to get extracted is what can lead to fatigue.
That's the burn, right? The hydrogen ions?
Yeah. It's not lactate. It's the hydrogen ions accumulating inside the muscle cells. That's really the burn.
All right. Once and for all, let's get this lactic acid thing settled here. what this, from what I'm told, that is not a thing. Like
Not a thing at all. No.
Where the hell that comes from, man? I mean, that's everywhere.
It's basically like way back in the day from like X-Phys 101, people were talking about this lactate shuttle.
Yeah.
And that's what people use when they need more energy and they start to utilize carbohydrates as a fuel source. But it's not the shuttle itself that's causing issues. It's that byproduct of these hydrogen ions that are attached that come along for the ride and create some acidosis inside the muscle cell itself.
Oh, dude. Okay, now I'm getting connecting the dots here. Okay, so I actually said this on the last podcast. So the person who was on right before you, a solid precursor here. She is. Are you familiar with High-Octane?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Have you ever done it?
No.
Dude, we got to get you out there, man. Come on. I'm a High-Octane athlete. I do some work with High-Octane. Love what they do. The person who's on before you is Maria Fetchik. She's one of High-Octane's elite 15 athletes, and she does this. She does she bought her own lactate meter, and she's locked in, right? And which is kind of rare for that community because typically there's not a high level of science mind. It's kind of that CrossFit vibe where it's just like volume, and just kind of like the last man standing wins.
Yeah.
Who's got the most resilience. So I actually mentioned to her because I've read this book. Have you ever heard of this book, The Science of Marathon?
I sure have.
Oh, dude, man. You know what's so funny? The guy I told you about before this podcast, who also lives in Austin, he was the one who told me about it. So maybe it's a super popular book out there in Austin. But so that's where I first heard this like acidosis term. And the author of that book is a French name. I actually don't know if it's a male or female, but he or she, they were talking about how being able to produce force and energy in the presence of these hydrogen ions and this acidosis was like a very key training component of quote training for the marathon. Am I checking the boxes here?
Totally.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Okay. So just reiterate for me because I'm a little unclear. Where did the hydrogen ions come from?
So it's through this process known as the lactate shuttle. So the easy way to kind of parse this out for listeners is when we're at rest, our predominant fuel source is fat. So we're using fat oxidation predominantly. That's why people might have heard of the fat burning zone before and things like that. As the intensity of any given exercise, whether it's walking, running, sprinting, weightlifting, increases, your preferential fuel source is going to change to meet the demands of a given exercise. So at a certain point in time, you're going to have a split where you start to rely more on carbohydrates as a predominant fuel source. And carbohydrates are a lot less substantially driven inside of our cells than fat. We have almost an endless amount of fat to utilize as energy. Carbohydrates, if you're thinking about a marathon runner, that carbohydrate storage can last for around 2 to 3 hours max. And that's with the assistance of some of these secondary physiological mechanisms that help us to convert energy via carbohydrate oxidation.
Okay.
So lactate basically comes at a certain point where we start to have to utilize carbs for energy, and we're just not using it quick enough because we need to keep going, keep pushing. And lactate comes along for the ride to drive more carbohydrates into our cells to utilize to continue to work at the same intensity we're already working at.
There it is. Right. That's the buildup. Okay. So I'm testing lactate. What does the protocol look like for that?
So for most people, and the reason it's most beneficial is to really find the sweet spot for their zone 2 training. So you can argue that you want to test an entire lactate curve while someone is doing a CPAT test. I would say probably not necessary because no matter what happens after you hit what's between a lactate level of 1.7 and 2 millimoles, that lactate level is going to continually climb as you exert more intensity. So for most people, again, using lactate to find the sweet spot for their zone 2 training is going to be where they derive the majority of the benefit.
Okay. So here's a question that I've asked on this podcast at least 3 times. So my listeners might be sick of me answering it or asking it, but I haven't gotten an answer yet. What is zone 2 training?
So from a physiological standpoint, zone 2 is having a blood lactate between 1.7 and 2.0 millimoles per liter. That's it.
There it is, team. There it is, team. Okay. So it's an exertion level. That's what we're talking here.
Yeah. And you might have heard of zone 2 or anything else described as the all-day pace.
Huh. Yeah, that's it.
It comes from having a blood lactate between 1.7 and 2 millimoles, because that's the rate of lactate accumulation, where physiologically your body can still clear out those hydrogen ions we were talking about without creating an excessive amount of fatigue.
Yeah, I mean, most of the answers that I've got, like I think, have you ever heard of, it's kind of a slight side note, have you ever heard of RPR, reflexive performance reset?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So, I mean, this was like, I don't think it's still popular, is it?
No, it's popular like, I want to say like 5-6 years ago.
Yeah. So it was like, you just like rub these like areas of your body and you get these like, I guess it was range of motion changes. It had very, remember the power balance bands?
Yeah.
It really reminded me of that a little bit. Like hold out your arm. They're like jam it down, hold the band, and then they're like, well, you can't. It doesn't go anywhere. But RPR, like I used to have all these people try to explain it to me, and it really felt like people were just throwing a big word at me and just made me and expecting me to be like, oh, neurology. And I was like, wait, what about neurology? It's a big concept there, buddy. And so like I've kind of felt a similar vibe with zone 2, where it was almost as if like there's this like curtain where like zone 2 and I was supposed to stop speaking. And I'd really like, well, what the heck is that? And the way that it's always been explained to me, and to be fair, nobody's ever explained it to me this way, but I just kind of connected this dot, was that this was Joel Jameson, ultimate MMA conditioning, aerobic capacity of the eccentric ventricular contraction, where we're just expanding the amount of blood that the heart can hold. Is that zone 2?
Yeah, that's just another way to identify it, really.
Okay. Well, I guess
hard to know if you're there or not using heart rate, using RPE, because you don't have the metrics to back up whether you're working too hard or too easy.
So this is a blood test we're talking about here, right?
Yeah. So the way it works is you probably start at a pretty easy pace. And the tricky part about testing lactate, outside of pricking your finger or your earlobe and then throwing it onto a little sample device, reading your blood lactate, is you want to make sure you're not too aggressive in terms of how you're increasing your intensity throughout the test. So what I typically recommend for people who want to dive down this rabbit hole is, if they're on a bike, starting at around 75 to 100 watts. If they're on a treadmill, starting at about a 3% incline, 3.0 miles per hour. And then making very small incremental increases every 4 to 5 minutes as they get these readings of their lactate throughout the course of their self-test.
All right. So look, it's a little involved here, right? And
it's very involved. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. You said it, not me. So why bother?
The biggest thing is really just accuracy and confirmation of your training zones.
How frequently are you testing?
So most people, I recommend testing quarterly. I will say that your lactate levels will fluctuate day to day. So you can test your lactate if you wanted to every time you do a zone 2 ride, zone 2 run, and you're going to see fluctuations mostly based on external variables. Your sleep, hydration, nutrition intake is even going to artificially inflate or decrease lactate readings. So it's kind of a moving target, but it can help people identify with what we're at. Yeah, right. It's always going to shift.
Well, so like as a kind of brain readiness guy, like if I'm a Tour de France rider, which is, I'm guessing, the people that would the type of athlete that would use this the most. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So if I'm a Tour de France rider, I'm going to want to know specifics about what food is making it easier for me to reach like thresholds here, right? And like which factors, what amount of sleep, what amount of hydration, like that sounds to me like a way to super dial this in.
Totally.
And that's what they're doing?
Yeah, if you can control all the other variables, you'll have more confidence that you're at the right exertion level during your zone 2 rides, because you won't have to worry about all these variables fluctuating on a day-to-day basis.
Are Tour de France riders or anybody else, is this a daily thing for them?
A lot of them, every time they're on their long rides, they will test lactate, not every 5 to 10 minutes, maybe every 20 to 40 minutes. I think it's important to remember that these people are doing such insanely high amounts of volume.
Yeah. That's an unreasonable expectation on that on the volume. They're going like 200 miles a day, right?
It's nuts. Like they're happening at 80 to 100 miles per week at minimum.
Yeah. Okay. So, all right. So let's kind of skew this back in here. So, like, obviously, I mean, hey, maybe we got Teddy Pogacar listening to this podcast. Who knows? All right. I was at High Rocks with Lance Armstrong, so maybe he's a big fan of mine at this point. I can't imagine any other scenario. But let's pull this into your wheelhouse a little bit in terms of longevity. Obviously, from like an exertional standpoint, what we're talking about here, this matters. But how would you present that to somebody who's like, I'm not an athlete, like truly, like the estimate's fine. Like I don't need that. We're talking if somebody's like, I really just want to be dialed in on that longevity and the health span. How do you present that to them?
I'm sure at some point someone has mentioned on a podcast mitochondria.
Nope, dude, you're number one, man. This is only episode 8 or so, all right? So you're kicking us off here.
So mitochondria, for those that don't know, or thinking back to like 3rd grade bio, is the powerhouse of the cell.
That's it.
Right. So zone 2 training from a physiological standpoint is where we're maximizing the efficiency of our mitochondria. And that would then correlate with building out this very robust aerobic base. And I think about cardiovascular training as kind of like this pyramid, where zone 2 is the base of that pyramid. Zone 5 is the peak, that's max effort. So the wider your base is, the higher that peak is going to be able to achieve.
And then, how does the lactate testing? I mean, I understand, but how do you present that particular aspect to somebody who's longevity focused?
The biggest thing, especially with someone with this lens and the general listener who probably doesn't have 30 hours a week to work out, is we want to make sure you're as efficient as possible with your workouts, right? You don't want to spend hours a week wasting your time. So testing your lactate and knowing the correct exertion level to be at during your zone 2 walks or rides will allow you to accumulate enough volume and enough intensity for all the really good physiological adaptations via the mitochondria, left ventricular hypertrophy, but it will allow you to do so in a manner that's not too high of intensity, that will contribute to fatigue across the entirety of the week.
So are you asking somebody to, here's what I'm honestly thinking. I know my mom's going to listen to this. I know she's going to be locked in on the longevity stuff. And I know she's going to be like, I'm not pricking my finger, right?
Yeah.
But I think that I don't think she's unreachable in that department. Like, how frequently are you asking somebody to do that who's just an everyday longevity person, just trying to do the best they can? They're pushing, right? I think you're not gonna be a lactate tester if you're just casually going through and they're like, I hope to live to 100. You're saying like, I'm a little dialed in here. So if I'm a little dialed in, what's the protocol that you're asking me to test this?
It's going to be about every 2 to 3 months.
Okay, that's not bad.
Now, and the way that we inform people to how to best take these readings and these metrics and apply them without continually testing
Right.
is to use perceived exertion, which sounds weird, but the best proxy for zone 2 outside of lactate is actually utilizing RPE, funny enough. And the RPE that tends to fit best and match closely with lactate between 1.7 and 2 millimoles again is if you're on a walk or on a ride, someone's next to you, you're working, you're sweating, you're feeling it, but you can have a conversation with them. That conversation is probably slightly strained, where you're probably not thrilled that you're having a conversation, but you can still do it if you needed to. So what I'll have people do is they'll auto-regulate their zone 2 training in real time. So if they know their target lactate heart rate is going to be around 135, they might adjust up or down to 130 or 140, depending on how they're feeling on a given day.
I'm super interested in I can't get it off my mind, how certain other factors and how the lactate, like the levels will fluctuate to moving target. That's really fascinating to me. Have you found, like, I mean, besides like common, like obvious, like didn't get enough sleep, are there, like, what are the things that are moving that?
Number one, switching modalities. So a lot of times train right.
So like switching during a workout, like on a circuit?
Not even during a workout, just during the week. So some people, if they're runners, they might want to offload their joints a little bit, like hopping on a bike, or vice versa. Someone who's a cyclist might want to go on a walk or go on a jog.
So, okay. So that kind of brings us to what we were talking about pre-show, was that movement economy. Is that the connection?
You set the connection.
There it is, man. Wow. So that's actually like a stressful event to do that?
Yeah, it's just you're not efficient at the modality you're not most comfortable with, or you're not as efficient anyway. So you're going to exert more energy to accomplish the same task. So for me, for example, if I'm out for a run, I know, and I've been testing my lactate for 3 or 4 years now consistently. Yeah. I know if I'm out for a run or a jog, I'm going to be at a heart rate of 145 to 150 BPM, and that's my zone 2 thresholds. If I hop on a bike, though, I'm going to drop down to 130 to 135 because I'm just not very efficient there.
So that begs the question, should you switch?
I think, honestly, it depends on what the rest of the program looks like. Obviously, we want to be mindful of orthopedic limitations and movement dysregulation or compensations that tend to arise. So I think there's value for some people to switch from a movement variability standpoint.
Right.
You look at any of these endurance sports, most of the injuries that tend to happen are a result of overuse patterns, using the same tissues, the same joints over and over and over again, never really giving yourself a break. So I think there's something to be said that if you do want to switch up your workouts, and you might feel a bit better doing this, doing a session on the treadmill or running, doing a session on the bike, doing a session on the rower, if your goal is overall health.
Yeah. So like, I mean, I feel like I'm weighing a lot of factors here and thinking of that programming where, like, part of me is like, okay, maybe like from a strictly cardiovascular system standpoint, like sticking with one thing would be beneficial, but then you're thinking of overuse injuries. Then I'm also thinking of the variability in the neurology of just ramping that prediction cycle of this is the thing that I'm doing every single day, and just myelinating those pathways to no end is certainly not the game that we want to play there. So I guess we do got to have to weigh all of the factors involved there. Let's talk a little bit about that movement economy, because it's something, one of the interesting things that I've learned in terms of like training, heart training, cardiovascular generally conditioning, the aerobic system just has more moving parts. So there's more areas for us to train. Whereas the anaerobic speed, the power stuff, there's just less available areas to train. There's less systems and processes. And I see runners quite a bit, and the easy low hanging fruit is strength training, like the easiest. And it's just the oxygen utilization of the muscles. It's the movement economy. It's how good you are at like doing that. So Dan, take it away a little bit on that movement economy stuff.
Yeah, so if someone's inefficient with their movement or they have to work too hard to achieve a task, they're exerting more energy. And higher levels of energy exertion leads to higher increases in lactate typically. Also likely leads to higher risk for potential injury down the line. So movement economy, the best way to think about it is how efficiently can we absorb and produce force?
So I'm thinking of this woman that I've trained who she came to me 4 weeks before she was going to run a 10-mile race, and she couldn't run more than a quarter mile without getting like jarring knee pain. Obviously the challenge, right? So I was like, all right, like we've got 4 weeks here. She does not lift at all. So I was like, in the next 3 weeks, we're just going to smoke it, right? We're going to get every neurological adaptation that we can get. We're not going to get much tissue growth there. We'll take every adaptation we get. We'll take a little deload right before it. And then what we did is we went out and we ran. And dude, her heart rate went up to 170 in the snap of a finger.
Yeah.
Which was something that is new to me because having worked in the NBA, it's just Ferraris out here, man. You don't see that. And then I was like, yo, is this person about to have a heart attack? But the big thing for me, I was like, there's just not a lot working well, right? Her body just it's just pumping so hard to just meet the demands. So when we talk of movement economy, we're lowering the need for the heart to pump because the muscles are now using oxygen more efficiently. And I know you're big on strength training just in general. I know it's big on longevity. How do you use that where does that fall into this cardiovascular programming?
So as we get stronger neurologically, as tissues get larger and they hypertrophy a little bit, the amount of force that's required upon each tissue to move you at that same pace or same cadence is going to slowly become less and less and less.
Yeah.
The other side of the equation is also just movement inefficiencies, which is hard to speak about on a podcast, but having someone who knows and understands the gait cycle and proper gait mechanics can help a lot of people clean up what it looks like when they're walking, when they're running, so allow their joints to handle stress and distribute that force more evenly, which will, as a byproduct, allow someone to become more efficient.
I think in the science of marathon, I think they said that the number one way to improve your time was through movement economy. Does that sound right?
Yeah, and it's such a weird, opaque term because no one knows what movement economy is.
I actually really like the term. It sounds really like smart when you say it. Movement economy. One of the things I learned from that book was you talk about like just changing like stride length while you're running. Where like you just go in your normal speed, and then I'm like stuttering and like going really quick pace and just kind of using different tissue to go through it. Was surprisingly effective.
Yeah, I mean, when you change the inputs into what the lower leg and the foot has to do, what the hips have to do, what your pelvis has to do, that's going to alter demands. And it comes back to this concept we touched on a little bit, movement variability, where just having exposure and access to different positions, different planes of motion can help you exert less energy during all these cyclical tasks that you tend to do.
All right. So what I like to do here on these shows is I like to kind of box things in, and I'd like the people to have some semblance of a framework to go off of. So where I'm going here, where I see this is really at the foundation of what we're doing is we're trying to build this zone 2 aerobic cardio foundation. Let's call it for longevity. Is that fair?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So when I think about the aerobic energy system, it's the energy system that you and I are using to have this conversation, that the energy system that the listeners are using to do this. It's the energy and the production that you're using most 95% of the time of your life. So we really want that to be as efficient as possible, right? And that's going to lower overall stress loads, overall fatigue, right? All that stuff is going to be like your body isn't as physically taxed to live as if you have a good zone 2 cardiac base. Fair?
Percent.
Anything to add to that?
I would say if anyone wants to have an idea of what the VO2 max requirements are for just daily tasks or sports they enjoy, there's something they can look up on Google. It's the physical activity questionnaire, or not questionnaire. It goes the MET values, MET, lowercase s, physical activity readiness guidelines, and it'll have a list of like 300 different activities and the required MET values of each activity. So a MET, for those that don't know, equates to having a VO2 of 3.5 milliliters per kilogram per body weight. And if you know the MET value of an activity, you have an idea of what your VO2 max has to be to achieve that activity. And so from a longevity standpoint, if we're thinking about VO2 max, we're thinking about zone 2, as you mentioned, having a high VO2 max, having a robust zone 2 foundation is going to allow you to be more confident as you get older that you'll be able to do all these small little tasks you probably don't think about right now when you're 70 or 80 years old.
Okay. Tell people what VO2 max is.
So VO2 max is your maximum ability to utilize oxygen as it relates to exercise intensity. So as intensity of aerobic exercise increases, our demands from an oxygen utilization standpoint increase as well with that. Yeah. And the more robust your aerobic system is, the higher your VO2 max system is, the more oxygen you can get into the cells to utilize to continue to work at that high exertion level.
Okay. So VO2 max, we see VO2 max. Is that a measurement of oxygen? Is it a measurement of fuel economy? Is it fuel efficiency? That's what's happening? Is that what I'm measuring?
It's really not even fuel efficiency, honestly, because you can see some like CrossFit athletes, higher athletes who have really high VO2 max values. Right. So they're going to be somewhere in like the low to high 50s potentially.
Yeah.
But they may not be all that efficient when they're doing it.
So my question is, I think of my mom, right? Like my mom's not going to reach her VO2 max ever. Why is that intense measurement? I don't understand why she needs to know that. I mean, I get why, but like, why would it be important to someone like that?
It's one of the best predictors that we have when we look at the literature for all-cause mortality. So some of the metrics are kind of crazy. For example, if you compare someone with an elite VO2 max to someone who would fit the category of having a low VO2 max, and we use hazard ratios. So a hazard ratio basically fluctuates between negative whatever to potentially above 5.0. Yeah. So someone in that low status, if their hazard ratio is 1.0, the elite status might have a 4.04 hazard ratio, meaning that someone with an elite VO2 max at any given point over the course of a calendar year will have a 404% less likely chance of dying than the person who has a low VO2 max does.
So would you say that the VO2 max is like the way you're describing it to me, it almost feels like we have everything that we're doing from a training perspective, and then like the VO2 max is like your final grade.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. It's really the cumulative sum of all the work you've done.
Oh, dude, that is so good, man. That is so good.
And that's actually what makes it such a good metric to look at. Is it's not like there's so many variables and factors that go into having a high VO2 max, which is why the data supports it as such a strong tool for longevity, because there's no way you're going to have a high VO2 max if you have poor sleep, poor nutrition, poor hydration, you're stressed out all the time. You're not going to be able to reach that target.
Yeah.
So these two of all these various stressors and managing those stressors as it relates to cardiovascular performance.
Okay. So, all right, let's box this in. Zone 2, foundation. Okay.
Yeah.
Zone 2 is the foundation. It is your ability to, it's like how stressed out is your body and your life just living. Training is a way to improve that zone 2 foundation for life. Lactate threshold is what we are looking at in terms of the actual training to dial you in and make sure that you are being as specific and efficient with the work that you're doing. And then the VO2 max is, I love this quote, dude. The cumulative sum, is this your quote? The cumulative sum of all the work you've done? Wow. Yeah, that's good, man. That's good. I'm going to paste that all over social media. Okay. Zone 2, lactate threshold, VO2 max. Okay, so here's my next question, because I've dug into the longevity world, and I know that strength, like literal muscle mass, is a big deal. And when I think of somebody with a high VO2 max, I think of Teddy Pogacar and everybody, and Jonas Vingegaard, the Tour de France guys, and they're these little skinny dudes, right? So what gives? How are we balancing that? Is there like a point of VO2 max? First of all, what is their VO2 max? And is there a point where it's like you're not getting as much bang for your buck above 55 or something like that?
Yeah, their VO2 max is so high it's crazy. They'll be somewhere in the 70s to 80s if you ever test them, which is,
oh my god, are they even sweating like when they're out there?
Like, they're running like a 6-minute mile and they're barely breaking a sweat.
Oh, God bless them, man. God bless them. So how do we compare? What do we do about this? This need for the VO2 max, but at the same time, this need for muscle mass. And start me off by just kind of explaining why the muscle mass is important.
Yeah, so muscle mass really is, from a literature standpoint, the best proxy we have for muscular strength. It's so incredibly hard to perform a research study looking at strength across the board, just because, number one, you have to pull data subjects who probably just aren't really good at whatever task it is you're asking them to do, whether it's a squat, a bench, a deadlift, to make it simple. So it's just hard to really find strong supporting data that looks at strength. But we know that there is a correlation typically between muscle size and muscle strength.
So like the question is then, what I don't understand is, like, to me, the VO2 and the strength and the need for mass are conflicting training variables.
Yeah.
Is there how do I blend that?
Yeah, so I would say, if we're looking at the two different categories, I would like to see someone have a target having a VO2 max if they're in their 30s, 40s, or 50s, somewhere in the high 40s to low 50s, which is completely achievable while still having a good amount of lean mass. And the lean mass comes into the longevity equation because sarcopenia, muscle wasting, is a disease really that's so chronic in America. And as we get older, our muscle mass declines at about, after the age of 35, 10 to 12% per decade. So I like to use the analogy of both of these things, VO2 max and lean mass, as almost this glider analogy, where the higher you can get that glider when you're in your 20s, 30s, and 40s, the more graceful that decline is going to be later on in life. And I think everyone here knows someone who, into their 70s or 80s, completely lost the ability to perform normal tasks that they were used to doing even 10 years ago. So muscle tissue acts to protect our joints to some degree. It helps us absorb and produce force. So making sure we have an adequate amount of lean mass can help from the functional aspect of how we want to live our lives day to day when we're older.
Yeah. So for me then, I'm thinking, what do I like? So I'm focused right now. I'm training for High-Rocks. I want to crush my time here. Right. And so for me, it's like heavy cardio based, and I'm losing weight probably not anymore, but as I was training, like I'm like dropping, I'm sure muscle mass along the way. Is that, I mean, from a longevity standpoint, is that of any concern?
Not really, because I know you train for a while. It's not like
Okay.
you're brand new training, so you already have a good amount of lean mass compared to the general population in America.
Yeah.
I would say it is concerning when we look at someone who only does cardiovascular training. We talked a little about the movement economy side of things, but the other part of this is someone who continues to do their runs and their bikes later on in life. We don't want to have them put in a potential scenario where if they fall, they're going to be at an increased risk for fracture, right?
Yeah.
And everyone knows someone who's fallen and breaking a hip or fractured a vertebrae in their L spine or something like that. So having more robust, stronger muscle tissues can help us absorb that force to some degree if a fault were to happen when we're in our 70s or 80s.
Okay, so here's where I want to bring this full circle. I think we've got a really good base here. We've got the cardio base. We got the lactate threshold of testing that exertion. Actually, I'm really grateful for the information. I'm going to get a lactate meter. I just want to see. I just want to check it out, man. And then we've got VO2 max and the strength stuff. I'm curious to know if you've run into this. I'll give you a quick story. So I was doing like this group workout in New York, and it was like this charity workout. Like everyone's kind of working out, and it's all fitness levels. And I had these two ladies in my group with me, and we were doing like TRX row, and I'm just cranking on this TRX row, pouring sweat. And I looked down at my watch, and it was like 150 or something like that. And the gal next to me, she's like, "What's your heart rate?" I was like, 152. She's like, "Oh my God." Like, she's like freaking out. I was like, "What's yours?" And she looks down and she's like 102. And she's like, "How do you get your heart rate up that high?" I go, "What do you mean? What do you mean?"
I'm just working.
I'm just getting after it here. And so the reason I bring that up is because what I've seen is for certain demographics, they don't grasp that level of hard work. And by all means, they think they're working hard.
Yeah.
And this kind of stuff is not easy, right? I mean, some of the zone 2 stuff can be pleasurable, right? It's not like super intense things, but we're talking about like real strength training that gets the job done. We're talking about VO2 max. Like, to really budge a VO2 max, there's a certain level of intensity that's required. Have you run up against this demographic that just kind of, they believe they're doing something? They're not an athlete or whatever it is. They've never been exposed to that super high intensity of exertion. Have you seen that before?
All the time.
Okay. So how do you, and this is a coaching question, like, I don't know, like, how do you push through that?
I think it's really the education piece of why we're doing it and why we have to work to that intensity.
Yeah.
And also just getting someone to understand what it feels like to actually take a set to the point where they're close to or at failure does wonders to create a reference point for someone.
What are you using are you just like, I mean, a VO2 max test is going to get them that. I mean, you could get a wrong VO2 max test though, no? If they're not put there?
Yeah, depending on calibration of software, how strong the person administering the test is in terms of knowing the physiology. So you can get some flunky numbers by all means.
So, I mean, truthfully, like, I'm curious, when you run into these people, I mean, like, I feel like there'd be resistance to them. Like, I always get the internal resistance. It's like, I am working hard. Like, I can't go harder than this. And like, as a coach with liabilities, like, I'm like, how do I do this? Like, you have the heart rate, you're here, you probably can go a lot higher than that, but I don't know. You got any thoughts there?
I think it all comes back to getting better at what's important to them. So it's like the whole Simon Sinek start with why kind of thing. So like, why are you doing in the first place? What it is that you want to achieve? And then mapping out what their goals are to what prerequisites are required for them to be able to do so.
Yeah. All right. So here we go. Zone 2. Let's put this stuff in a box. Zone 2, lactate threshold, tests exertion. VO2 max is the final score. I mean, we got to ask the basic question. How accurate are the Apple Watches and smartwatches?
They're all over the place. So they're not anywhere close to a decent job submitting VO2 max.
How are they measuring that?
It's funny. I looked into this so much and I can't find an answer.
I just kind of assumed it was like an algorithm.
It's definitely an algorithm. I went like deep down to like the Apple forum rabbit hole trying to figure out what actual equation is used and what AI is used. And the best thing that I come up with is they just look at your distance covered over a certain period of time in combination with your heart rate, but very vague, not specific. So I'm not sure exactly how they calculate these VO2 max values you'll see in your Apple Health app.
Yeah, the Oura Ring, they now say, like, you do like a walking test.
Yeah.
How much ground can you cover in 6 minutes? So maybe they're using some sort of measurement like that.
Yeah, if anyone wants to look up some of these different estimates for VO2, you can type in VO2 max estimator on Google and you'll come up with a bunch of different things for walking, cycling, rowing. And it'll kind of give you a ballpark where you're at. But obviously the test is going to be much more hyper-specific in terms of...
What do you got on the Cooper's test?
Cooper's test is great. It's a great baseline. It's great to give someone an idea of where they're at. It typically has an error range from about 2 to 3 mLs per kg per minute in either direction. So if your Cooper's test comes back out and you have a VO2 max of 45, you could be anywhere from a 42 to a 48.
So for those not in the know, the Cooper's test is how far can you run in 12 minutes?
Yeah.
What I have found is that on the Cooper's test, like the first time you run it, you're like don't know how to pace it.
Exactly. You're trying to leave some gas left in the tank when you need it.
It is. Yeah. So like I remember thinking after the first one, I was like, I probably could have gassed it up a little bit quicker, a little bit sooner. So I think like the second or third one's probably a little bit more accurate. Okay, zone 2, lactate, VO2, strength training, movement economy. Yeah, we covered some ground here.
Yeah.
As if we'd have it any other way, right? On movement economy. All right, so look, the last thing that you really brought up pre-show, we'll close it off with that, man, is the respiratory components. The zone 2 stuff is sexy. I guess the respiratory stuff is underneath all of this. It's funny, man. I spent a lot of time today talking about like the secrets of respiration. What are your secrets of respiration here?
So I think the easy way to think about respiration is when we inhale, we're creating an expansion through the rib cage. Yeah. When we exhale, we're creating compression through the rib cage. And that expansion and compression cycle, from a mechanical standpoint in terms of joint health and orthopedic risk and things like that, it's almost like you're stretching your tissues from the inside out 20,000 times per day.
Yes.
So if your respiration mechanics are slightly inefficient or altered or not optimal, you could be placing more strain on certain muscle tissues and less strain on other muscle tissues. And that may, over time, lead to some of these overuse patterns that people tend to exhibit and tends to lead to small little nagging injuries long term.
Yeah. And also let's just point out that the diaphragm is in fact a muscle, and it costs energy to breathe, and having that as efficient as the legs and the hamstrings, the glutes and the hip extension, all that stuff is just as important as everything else. And through the training process, you become better at that. Question for you on this. I noticed at Hyrox, we had Lance Armstrong come into the tent, and there's only really two things I noticed about it, but one specific to this. He had a really wide, like, barrel rib cage.
Yeah.
And I was like, man, I bet he's able to take in way more oxygen with this thing. Have you seen this?
Yeah, totally.
Am I right on this?
You're right.
Damn, dude. Yeah, I mean, this thing, have you run into him out there?
Yeah, I have a couple of times.
Okay. He's got, have you noticed that as well in him?
Oh, yeah. It's like that wide infrasternal angle kind of thing going on.
Yeah, for sure. I thought that was really interesting. Okay, last question I have for you, because this is like this is my favorite thing in the world is the brain, and there's obviously like a huge. I mean, it's the most expensive process that the body runs in terms of energy and fuel. Do you do anything? Do you guys do anything in terms of regulating, managing central nervous system, anything like that?
All the time.
Okay, talk to me a little bit about that.
We deal with a lot of people who are very, very incredibly hyper type A.
Yeah.
Which means that they're probably stressed out way too much. They're always on, they never turn off. And they're always trying to push, whether it's at their job, whether it's with their family, whether it's in their workouts. It's always that mindset of more is better. And I'm going to continually push. So they're almost constantly in this upregulated, sympathetically driven state. And we have to teach them how to downregulate their CNS to allow, number one, for them to become more metabolically flexible. Because if you're upregulated, you can't utilize fats. And also to actually get better at their cardiovascular training, because if you're upregulated during your zone two is not going to improve because you have nowhere else to go. So this kind of ties back to managing stress. It ties into respiration patterns. So someone who's very upregulated, you'll kind of see that classic barrel chest posture when they're performing anything, but also when they're out for their run. You'll see that chest puffed up and back, and you'll see them compress the backside of the rib cage, which means when that rib cage is compressed on the backside, they're not getting that full expansion into their lungs with each inhale. So they're so inefficient that they have to then hyperventilate to continue to work. So they're breathing somewhere between 60 to 70 breaths per minute, which is insanely high because they have to hyperventilate to continue to utilize oxygen because they're not getting that expansion and compression through the rib cage, and their diaphragm's not fully descending with an inhale and ascending with an exhale.
I mean, what an absolute tease to drop this 55 minutes into this podcast. Man. Okay. So I have to crossroads this for time purposes. I would love to dive down at how you're regulating that, and maybe I'll squeeze it in at the end if I can. But I think what hit me the most there, and I know it's going to hit everybody the most, we've got to hit it, is if you're upregulated, you can't use fat. This is what I've always said. Okay. So I've always said this about the last 5 pounds crew, right? I can't burn like this little spare tire that I have right under my belly button. And I've always said, this is stress. This is stress. You can't get that. That does not go away if you can't down-regulate the system. Can you expand upon that? That is a huge concept.
Yeah. So with these chronic levels of stress, you also tend to see chronic levels of cortisol. I'm sure everyone's heard of cortisol as this bad thing at some point in time. Cortisol is a stress hormone. It's a natural hormone that we use in our brains and our bodies as we're stressed out. So it's not a bad thing. It's normal. But when cortisol becomes chronically elevated, that's when we run into issues there. So someone who is highly type A, overly sympathetically driven, they can't downregulate their nervous system. So even when they're at rest, bringing this back to lactate, they'll probably have pretty damn high resting lactate values. So you might see someone in that phenotype who has a resting lactate of 1.5 to 1.6. So when they're just sitting down, they're already at this point in time where they're burning about 50% of their fuel from carbs, which is nuts.
Dude, I hope people are listening to this. I hope people understand what this is right here. So are they? I never saw. I never heard this anywhere. This is just a suspicion of mine. Are they more anaerobically operating at rest?
100%. And you see it with how they move. You see it with the respiration. You see it with the results of their CPAT test. You see it with DEXA scans when you look at visceral adipose tissue, which is the fat that surrounds the sort of organs and becomes metabolically inflammatory. So all of these things tie into stress.
Oh man. Okay, so I have to ask. I'm sorry. Do you have to go?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Well, then how are you doing, how are you down regulating the nervous system? How do you coach people through that?
Number one, it starts with some breathing drills before and after the workouts.
Yeah.
And those breathing drills also become something that we try to have them implement throughout the course of the day as well, just to find little areas for opportunity where they can sneak in some down regulation. And then the other factor that comes into this is, again, making sure that they're not working too hard during their zone 2 efforts.
Yeah.
So I'd rather have.
Will that mitigate it if you're it? Because like I'm thinking like, do you know who Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor is?
Yes.
Okay, so I just had her on my podcast, and she was talking about like shooting free throws at a game, and she's like, just imagine like you're at play, like don't think of it as stressful. And I'm like, wow, this is easier said than done, you know. And so like I think about the people that you're working with and these high type A, people, and either 16 hours, 12 hours of their day is spent in that mode. Are we? How much can we mitigate that through simple breathing, simple zone 2 techniques?
I think I would say if there is a potential for 100%, we can probably get 30 to 40% of the return on investment there.
Okay.
Just some of these strategies, implementing them. The reality is obviously a lot of external factors, psychology, emotional state is also going to feed into it.
Yeah.
But what we tend to recognize is as people learn to know what it feels like to downregulate their nervous system, they start to become more self-aware of what's going on throughout the rest of their day.
Yeah. I read an article a while ago that said something to the effect of, you didn't realize you were feeling bad until you started feeling good. And I guess that kind of lends itself into what you're saying there. If you start understanding what it feels like to relax, then you may be able to be in pursuit of that a little more. Man, I'm so glad we went there. I did not expect to go there. I have a particular client of mine that we've really been working on this. Those last 5 pounds. As soon as I'm done cutting this up, I'm sending it to him. Dan, thank you so much for doing this, man. Thank you so much for reaching out on Instagram and shooting me a message and letting me know about this lactate stuff. I'm really trying to get better at it. I want to be a world champion. Not a world champion. I think that's a bit much. I want to be at world championships for high rocks. I just want to get to that level. It's getting increasingly more difficult, and really trying to weigh the balance between training, science, just doing hard stuff, all that volume I was talking about, and just trying to figure it out. And what we talked about here today. There's a lot of helpful information here for me, and then we went into a lot of other helpful stuff. I know my mom's going to appreciate it too. So, Dan, tell the people where they can find you if they want to learn more.
So I really don't put out a lot of social stuff. I tend to keep my stuff tight knit, but if you want to find me on Instagram, my Instagram handle is Dan_Cerone, CERONE, and anyone's more than welcome to reach out via DM if they have any questions or want to work with me further.
And it's outstanding. Dan, do you make it back to New York at all?
I was actually just back there a couple of weeks ago, and I'll probably be back in another couple of weeks. So I'm bouncing back and forth between New York.
All right. Listen, next time you're in town, come by. We'll get a workout in, and we'll measure our lactate together.
I'll bring my meter with me.
My man. Dan, thank you so much. Much appreciated, and we'll talk to you soon.
Awesome, Sean. Thank you.